as Matane said, my name's Carson Smuts. I'm from South Africa, and I've been working here at City Science with Kent for, I think since 2013. And over the course of that time, the lab has transitioned quite a bit. So I'll walk you through some of that history. But sensing has always been like a core function of our group. And I'll explain why that is and what that has to do with cities or city science. I know how fast these things can go, so if you want to ask questions, maybe it's a good idea to type them in while I'm talking. You can go to that link and just drop the questions in there. Just makes it easier. And also, it's always nice to have a record of what people were thinking during the presentation for next time. So city science, in my presentation, I'm going to be kind of talking about cities with superpowers. But really, cities are the home to many, 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 many people. And that's becoming a more prevalent sort of trajectory for people as time goes on. People want to move to cities because that's where the opportunities tend to be. There is this thing that Winston Churchill once said, which is we shape our buildings and thereafter they shape us. And that's quite a profound thing, right? You create these spaces for spatial praxis, which is essentially creating space where people live out their lives. And then from then on out, it starts to inform how people do so. Then there's John Culkin, who this is sometimes misattributed to Marshall McLuhan, who was the one who said the medium is the message, or the message is the medium, either way around. But he said, we become what we behold, and we shape our tools, and they shape us. So this is very close to Winston Churchill. And I'll talk a bit more about this at the end, but I wanted you to keep this in mind because I've heard this around the Media Lab during my time here, which is at the Media Lab, we shape technology, and thereafter it shapes us. So the health of tomorrow has been a central focus of ours. It really became prevalent during the COVID pandemic when we were trying to think about our own research and the trajectory it should take during that time. And it really became from one of the health of tomorrow to the home of tomorrow, because the home is essentially where health begins in our perspective. Now, this is quite a huge undertaking on many levels, one of them being that there is massive inequality. When it says age here in place, what it means by aging in place, it doesn't mean just the elderly, it means those who age in place. And that can be across all demographics. And if you look at the demographics, there is a significant sort of divide or gap between equality, especially when it comes to health outcomes and life expectancy. So place is kind of an important word for us. And our lab actually used to be called Changing Places. It only became City Science maybe, 2016? 15? Right. And so before that, it was called Changing Places at the Media Lab. And now we have different pillars of work in the lab, and one of them is still Changing Places, and that's where we do a lot of the sensor work. And the idea is, it's kind of a double entendre. It's like, it goes back to those sayings I showed at the beginning of the slides. We develop technology that ultimately impacts and influences place, but we also want to think about how places change. So it's not only about influencing, but it's also about listening. And so with respect to the home, this is one of a very old project back in the days of House N. This was before Changing Places. So Kent actually had a lab outside of the Media Lab on campus called House N. And that was related to the architectural school, the architectural department. They did a lot of interesting work with apartments and sensing, and some of that I'll go through now. One of them was the Home Genome Project, which was about trying to understand, based on different profiles of sort of age and gender and, say, profession, what sort of layout in an apartment suits a particular demographic best. So this was very much like data gathering and classification. Now, at the end of the day, we have these crazy cities and everything's busy and there's a lot going on. And as the body ages, it becomes very different, right, for the body to move through space. So with all this high-speed movement, we also have to consider, the spaces for the body, which include isolation, sanctuary, and oasis. Essentially, that's when the body takes time to heal. So it's great to think that, cities are machines, and that people are sort of these little gears that operate within them. But we're slightly different in that we do need downtime, and we need time to heal. So this brings us to one of the fundamental questions that guides our work. Can cities serve both the young and the working and the elderly simultaneously? And this is no small task. At the end of the day, we're talking about spaces that become sort of multimodal, right? Like a space that maybe during the day is one thing, but a space in the evening that becomes something else. And so this has been a driver for a lot of our work. And so some of the projects that we've been exploring have to do with transformations, right? How does one space become something else? So freedom of movement. I'm sure you guys are familiar with the PEV projects and the automobile projects that we do in the group. And this has to do with novel delivery systems, but also, how do you deliver packages at one point and then deliver people at a different time of day? Transformable architecture. I don't know if that's been presented to the group yet. Yeah, so you've seen that, and I'll touch on that a bit just now. And then obviously, the city scope, which is all about walkable districts and trying to understand connections between citizens. And so these bring up various challenges with respect to different phases of life. So the city car was interesting. It was a project that kind of redefined, what is an electric vehicle. And then from there, we get to the PEV, right, which I'm sure you guys have seen as well, which was no longer about having to worry about cars that park, but cars that, vehicles that are autonomous can move around essentially without having to park. So the city car essentially became the PEV in many ways. So why sensing? How does sensing fit into all of this? Well, you can imagine, obviously, if you have a PEV moving around the city, it has to understand its context and where it's going and how it relates to different people. If a person walks up to it, if a dog's crossing the road, if a package is put inside of it, it kind of has to understand, where that package needs to go and maybe even the contents of that package. And so at the end of the day, it's really about superpowers, right? You can think of it as superpowers. The Media Lab has a wonderful history of sort of exploring this idea of instilling superpowers in both people and sort of inanimate objects. So some of the projects are Audiograph. I don't know if you know that project. It was basically here at the Media Lab. It was all about giving people superhero hearing, and you can look up Henry Holtzman for that. Our very own Thomas Sanchez, he did a project for his thesis called Panoptic, which was really cool. It was all about, creating sensory deprivation and then using technology to kind of focus on different aspects of senses to create a heightened sense. And then obviously, there's the stuff we find in Tangible Media Group, sort of augmenting the skin. And you can't sort of mention all of this without thinking of Hugh Hare's group, right? Which is the biomechatronics lab just down the corridor there. So back to city science and giving things superpowers. I'm sure we've touched on the city home already. The city home was essentially all about sensing, right? I mean, you walk up to this object, and the whole idea was that you don't talk to it, you don't type anything in. Just by moving your body in the space, the idea was that the architecture could transform in real time, creating essentially 300 square meters from 200 square foot. And the idea that, a bathroom becomes a living room, or a living room becomes a bed, things like that. And it was all about gesture. So here we were using a lot of sensing that had to do with sort of reappropriating technologies like Kinect, gaming technologies from Microsoft, that is, and also proximity sensors. You get these little sonar sensors which enable sort of depth perception for the actual microcontroller. And that was, this stuff can be achieved with fairly simple technologies, but when you bring it all together, the sort of tangible and spatial experience is quite impressive. This was the escape pod, which we created, which was, again, about creating sort of sanctuary of space inside of a city, where you could both work, play, and sleep throughout the day. And so you had sort of tables that became beds, and it was all about creating just sort of different user interfaces that would transform the user experience. So UI that transforms UX. And so here you could see we had dials that you put on walls and that transformed. And then obviously there's safety, right? So there's the sensing that comes into things like making sure that your cat doesn't get crushed by your bed, or your wine glass in this case doesn't get shattered. And so this is another project that we were exploring called Blind Eye, which basically brings all of that together, and it was using computer vision to understand how people play out their lives in those particular spaces. So in our group, we've developed our own sensor platform in the past called the Termites. This stands for the third iteration of MIT environmental sensors. And you can imagine this has a lot to do with all the projects that I showed you previously. Back during House N, they were known as just the MITES, MIT environmental sensors. And here's an apartment that Kent and Jason Narvane worked on, and maybe even Rich had something to do with it. But they outfitted an entire apartment here in Boston with all kinds of sensors. And I think there were over 200 sensors embedded throughout this tiny apartment. This was quite an undertaking because this is before we could rely on everything being wireless. So they had to work with the contractors and the people outfitting, the carpenters of the actual space. What they don't show is behind these cabinets and under the floor, there are miles and miles and miles of Ethernet cable just running all the way through this apartment. But these are the things that you could begin to get a sense of. And so subsequently, when things became wireless, we developed or more ubiquitous, should I say, in terms of wireless technology, we developed the Termites, which is essentially a small little sensor that we wanted to be able to deploy around the world and with various cities that we're working with, right? So you could hand somebody a bag of termites and they would plug it in wherever they want, and that's all they have to do. You connect to it with your cell phone, and through your cell phone, it connects to your Wi-Fi router and then starts streaming this information. And so there were various, anytime you develop a sensor, there's lots and lots of different iterations, but these were the 5 main iterations we went through. And it all has to do with optimization and sort of a balance between cost and manufacture and design when it comes to deployment. So you can't deploy sensors if each one is like $100. So recently this has all become very cheap, and the way you do that is you look at sensors that come out of these devices, right? A lot of what you see on the Termite is actually embedded in your phone. So the accelerometer, the humidity sensor, the light sensor itself. Some of the gas sensors don't necessarily come from these devices, but come from other devices that you might have in your home. And so they're manufactured in such large quantities, it's become really efficient to manufacture with regards to cost. And then obviously you have this interface which allowed researchers to interface with the Termite in real time. But you don't need this interface. The whole idea was you don't need a computer or plug it in via USB. I'm just showing you that, part of it is allowing researchers to program these things themselves, and I'll show you a little bit later why that's important. We deployed Termites on things like the zero-G space flights here at the Media Lab. We deployed them in Andorra in a school environment to try and we actually worked with the kids in the school so they could interact with the sensors as well and begin to understand how sensing works. And that was really interesting because we got to interact with not just the students, but the teachers as well. And this is kind of some of the visual summaries and imagery that we create that allow people to intuitively understand what's happening. So, a big part of the stuff we do with data is creating visuals that allow people to intuitively understand what's going on. So here you can see these are the 5 days of the week, right? These are the evenings, right? This is the weekend. And you can see that just by looking at it immediately. And then these are all the different rooms, right, going up. So you can see that certain rooms just are never used. Like this room is never used. That one is barely used. There's some activity there. And this is kind of important because you don't want to have to go through tons of spreadsheets or miles of spreadsheets to be able to understand what's going on. You also don't want to have to pass through it with code because that's also quite tricky when it comes to understanding what's inside of the data set. Let's see. So this was more like of what people would access when they were deploying them remotely. There was a worldwide map, and when you plugged it in, you would be able to find your termite and understand what's going on And I think some of the termites were deployed in India as well to try to understand some of the community-based initiatives that were happening with regards to sanitation. And so they were able to deploy those there as well. So at the end of the day, we get back to the superpower part, right? Okay, that's nice. You have all this data, woohoo. But at the Media Lab, I mean, other people can do that. We really try to create like something that's more, that has more sort of a magic quality to it. So these are termites, but now we created this sort of augmented overlay, which essentially allows you to see what the termites are doing in real time just by holding up your mobile device. And this becomes kind of magical because it's sort of like an X-ray view into what the data's, what the termites are detecting and what's happening in your building. So it's like giving your building the ability to talk to you. And you don't have to see the termites. They can be embedded in walls and floors and things like that. This was a very old system. I think this was 2016, and we were using, I don't even remember the platform name, but it was developed by Google. And subsequently, it's been discontinued. But this technology you now have in your phones, and I just wanted to show you what you can do if you have full control over the apps that you're developing on mobile devices and combine that with sensors. So here you can see the termite is not revealed in any way, shape, or form. And what happens is these mobile devices now understand their location inside of a room with spatial mapping that's a lot more sophisticated than what we had in 2016. But the idea is you could embed this in sort of ducts, you could embed this in sewer lines or sanitation lines, you could embed this in walls and floors. And on a practical level, you can imagine how helpful that is to the facilities and facility operations inside of a building. So here you can see there's one in the duct there. And we then took that sort of idea and we said, okay, well, there was a project we did with IKEA, the furniture company, where we deployed 150 of these sensors in Sweden. And the idea was to be able to create sort of a digital twin that really allowed you to see what was happening inside of this apartment in real time. Now, there was only one person living in this apartment because if there were two, the kind of idea didn't work. But with one person living in this apartment, you knew exactly how the person was moving throughout the day. You could see where they were spending most of their time. And the idea behind this was that it's not deployed into people's private homes, but this became a tool where IKEA could begin to understand how their products really affect people's day-to-day lives and what people are interfacing with most of the time. So here you can see that ribbon is narrowed down between 8:30 and 9 p.m. And that person was spending most of the time in the kitchen going between various cabinets and drawers and various devices in the room, appliances in the room, such as the oven and the fridge and things like that. So again, kind of a superpower in that you're creating this kind of live X-ray view of an apartment. And then, we've done other things that, take sensing and we embed them into our own little devices. This is called a tangible view cube. If any of you use Autodesk software, you have like a view cube in the top right that allows you to traverse the model and rotate. And this created a sort of a physical version of the view cube where you could put it on a cityscope table, turn it, place it anywhere on the table, and the virtual camera would fly there in real time. So here we were using IR sensing built into the actual view cube itself. And then at the end of the day, it had a gyroscope and accelerometer IMU built in with a magnetometer. And then there was a camera from above that was basically tracking the cube because the cube would glow. Essentially, it was a transparent object that glowed IR, so it was IR tracking from above. So here you can see no matter where you put it, or you could use it on the floor plan as well. So this was the IKEA model. And here you can see how multiple projects start to fuse together in our lab. So this is kind of the termites with the IKEA digital twin project with the tangible view cube all sort of gelling together. So I'll end by just saying, because I think my time's pretty much up, that going back to the original quotes that I was referring to, I think there's a problem with the way that we anthropomorphize technology today. The truth is, we shape the technology and we shape others. And I think it's important to recognize it's we, not technology, that shapes. And it's not that we're shaping ourselves, but we shape others. And this has a lot to do with sort of modernist theories of how tactics have been used for decades to basically separate the West's sort of cultural ideologies from nature itself. So this is an age-old thing where we use certain evidence-based technologies to pull ourselves outside of nature so that we look to nature as something else. But in the process of doing that, what we've done is we end up in this tricky situation where we see cultures outside of the West as something else, and the West as, in fact, a non-cultural entity. Dare I say, kind of godlike. So there's this promise of the digital that I want you guys all to keep in mind as you're thinking about data and sensing and gathering. That has a lot to do with the fact that, it's not created in a vacuum, and it doesn't exist in a vacuum. There is a pursuit here that is very much about modeling sort of a universal model of reality. And you need to ask yourself, if you're in this class, like, what is that promise? That involves a whole nother lecture that I could give. But if you're interested in that, there's two things that you guys could read. The one is We Have Never Been Modern by Bruno Latour, and the other is The Myth of the Machine and The Pentagon of Power by Lewis Mumford. And I'll just transition I'll hand off to Andres now. And before I do, I'll just reference this and say that, this is not a new endeavor, sort of data gathering. One of the first forms of sort of digital data gathering was actually conducted by John Snow back in the day during a cholera outbreak. And if you're interested in sort of knowing the history of sort of data creation, this is kind of a good place to start. And it shows sort of the power of data, and not only that, but it was the way he collected it and drew on the map sort of where things were happening. Just to sum it up, a lot of people were dying. They didn't know why everyone was dying. They thought it was the food. They thought it was the rats. They thought it was all kinds of things. At the end of the day, after he mapped out where people were dying, he found out that most people who were not getting sick were actually living at a brewery, right? And I was like, why a brewery? The reason people weren't getting sick at the brewery is because people who worked and lived at the brewery got to drink beer for free. So they're not going to drink, you're going to drink water or you're going to drink beer, right, if it's free. When you make beer, you boil the water. And so suddenly he realized, it has to have something to do with the water. And that's when they tracked it down to a nearby well. And surely enough, all those markings on the paper from the central pump outwards showed the majority of sort of the illnesses occurring. So Andres is going to dive into the termite CO2 studies project, which is essentially talking about what I alluded to, where the termites have become this platform that they can become any type of sensor. We've just kind of created the framework for it.